Well, Oregon State is unquestionably a program on the rise at the moment under Jonathan Smith. So, as the Big 12 has been lobbying for quite some time to get Pac-12 schools, why not Oregon State?
You are Locked On Pac-12, your daily podcast on the Pac-12 Conference. It's the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Locked On Pac-12. I'm your host, Spencer McLaughlin. Thank you so much for making this your first listen or your first view of the day. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, and your number one source to stay up to date with our media rights free and beloved Conference of Champions. Like, comment, subscribe, rate, review, please, and thank you wherever you listen to or watch this show. We're talking Oregon State today and much more about the Beavs, which means we have Carter Bahns, BeaverBlitz.com, senior editor and writer over there, also at the 24/7 Sports National Writing Desk. He's big time now, but he makes time for us, and we very much appreciate that. So, Carter, Oregon State represents a smaller school compared to others, but there are small schools in the Big 12 as well. So when I ask you that question, why isn't Oregon State ever mentioned as a target for the Big 12? They've gone after Arizona. They've gone after Colorado. We know that. Why not Oregon State?
I mean, I think the short answer is just that the value add isn't really there. And as you dive further into that, you get into the TV markets, you get into alumni base, all of these factors that kind of account for how much money a school can provide to a conference. And frankly, this is why Oregon State hasn't really been in conversations for any conference other than the Pac-12. It's just a small TV market. The ratings are just not there on game days. And frankly, I think the only way that Oregon State would be an attractive target for a conference is if it kind of piggybacked with one of the other prominent Northwest schools, such as Washington or Oregon. But as we know, Oregon and Washington aren't really on the Big 12's radar either. So, I guess the short answer there is Oregon State just wouldn't add enough value to the Big 12 to the point where, if Oregon State joins the league, the schools that are already there are going to take smaller cuts of their revenue sharing model to accommodate for Oregon State joining. So financially, it just doesn't make sense for a league outside of the Pac-12 to add the Beavers right now.
Yeah, I find the calculations for what makes, a valuable addition, I find it to be fascinating because when you look at Arizona, for instance, now I believe Phoenix is a higher rated media market than Portland, which is where, that's the biggest media market available to the Beavs. Obviously, they have fans that go throughout the Northwest, but when you're talking about the immediate geographical area, it's Portland as kind of like the most attractive, part of it there. Phoenix, bigger market than Portland, I believe, according to the Nielsen ratings. So that could be a component, but we see brands elevate beyond what their market indicates they should be able to draw. Oregon is a great example of this. Another one at the G5 level is Boise State. Boise State's in a tiny market. I mean, Boise is like Idaho as a whole is not a big state. It's not a very well populated state. But those two schools get an average viewership that goes well beyond what you'd say, the market size is really, really small, so the upside isn't there. I think for Oregon State, there's no reason they can't become a more watched team in college football. I think scheduling would change, which I'll get to in a sec. But I think that's kind of the model for them if they're thinking, whatever may happen. Let's say the Pac-12 stays together now, but things start to teeter again 5-6 years down the line. I think if you're Oregon State, you have to be thinking about, okay, can you build up your brand as a college football program to make yourselves more appealing to the Big 12 as, a potential fallback option. And I'm just saying that in the context of we have no idea what the future is actually going to look like because we don't even know what tomorrow is going to look like.
It's interesting, too, that idea kind of goes both ways in that you see UCF and Houston and Cincinnati joining the Big 12, larger markets, but smaller schools, whereas Oregon State's larger school, smaller market. So obviously the Big 12 was leaning towards the big markets. obviously programs in football that have been successful in recent years there as well, but banking on these schools taking advantage of greater levels of resources upon joining the Big 12 to elevate their brands, which is, exactly the same model that Oregon State would have to follow. It's, it's producing on-field success sustained over a long period of time. It's producing professional caliber players so that, people on Sundays are talking about Oregon State. It's all of these factors that go into building your football program's brand, which, as you mentioned, nobody on the West Coast has done a better job of that in the last 20 years than Oregon. Who's to say Oregon State can't do something similar if it starts to find on-field success? The resources are obviously, there's a discrepancy there. Oregon has greater.
I was going to say Phil Knight's name is going to come up in this conversation here momentarily.
Right, exactly. But no, I think you see it across the country too. Look at the SEC. There are big programs in the SEC that come from small markets.
Georgia and Alabama are not giant markets per se.
Exactly. Georgia has Atlanta, so we'll give them that. But Alabama,
okay, that's true.
Alabama is technically a small market team. Mississippi State. Everybody on the West Coast knows who Mississippi State is because of its success in baseball and football. That's a small market. So I think really it comes back to winning. If Oregon State consistently puts together 10-win seasons over the next 10 years. I think they'll have conferences knocking on their door, but right now, the track record of success isn't there. The brand is not big enough, and certainly the TV market doesn't help. But I do wonder as we go into this next age, where I think streaming will become a bigger part of college sports. How much do TV markets actually matter in a streaming era? At that point, it becomes more about alumni base and national interest rather than, how many people are living in the city of Portland, which obviously is where Oregon State's biggest alumni base is. I think that becomes less of a factor moving forward when people on the East Coast have just as much access to an Oregon State football game than people in Portland.
Yeah, I think you bring up a really interesting point on the streaming component and whether or not that will continue to matter. I guess, the population of the area can still play into that because that can affect how many people are going to, tune into the streaming surface locally. But I think that's an interesting question. By the way, whiff on my part on missing Atlanta as a major market. Nielsen's got it number 6 in the country. So that's an oversight for me. But that's why I've got Carter here, right? Someone's got to keep me in check for all my insanity and my crazy, wild, horrible, no good, very bad college football takes that you all continue to listen to, which I very much appreciate, by the way. But I think the other thing for Oregon State is if you're going to build up a brand, you've got to have games that people are going to want to watch, right? You have to win at a high level. You have to do stuff that, gets on people's radar. But you also have to be able to schedule the sorts of games. Part of your TV viewership in a given year is who do you play? Oregon State the last couple of seasons are playing a pair of Mountain West opponents. That's good and fine, but that feels more like, 2015 Oregon State in terms of the matchups they can get versus, for example, they went to Ohio State, I think, years and years ago. 2018. Yeah, they were down at that time and didn't really, have a snowball's chance in hell to win that game. But going forward, and this is why I wish scheduling was done on an annual basis, I feel like after the season Oregon State had a year ago, ideally, if you're trying to think about maximizing your television viewership and your brand as a program and you want to elevate that, maybe not to even be attractive enough to Power 5 conferences one day, but just to continue to grow within the conference that you're currently in, which is what Oregon State is more trying to do, you want to play those sorts of games that are going to draw an audience beyond just Pac-12 fans. And to do that, you have to be able to get quality Power 5 non-conference opponents and schedule a home and home.
And naturally, Oregon State was playing those top-tier opponents during the down years, and now that the Beavers are actually consistently good, they're starting to play Mountain West opponents. So it's kind of going opposite of how you would theoretically draw that up. Oregon State made trips to the Big House. They went to Michigan. They went to Ohio State. Went to Wisconsin about a decade ago, hosted Wisconsin, played at Purdue last year. So,
see, why did they get away from that stuff?
Really, it was the fan base was kind of clamoring to step away from it because Oregon State, frankly, didn't stand a chance in those games. But now that it does, I think now is the time to bring it back, right? I mean,
Yes.
there is something to be said for racking up wins against Mountain West teams and, helping your bowl eligibility, your odds of getting to the postseason and whatnot. I think Oregon State's beyond that now. It's already put together a 10-win season. Now it's about proving that you can go head-to-head against the very best. They do have a home-and-home scheduled against Ole Miss coming up, I believe, at the end of the decade.
Great.
Nice.
Can't wait to watch it when how old 30. Am I even? Oh, goodness. We're too old. Yeah. We're too old for that. You know what we're never too old for, though? Continue looking for jobs over at LinkedIn Jobs, because these days every new potential hire can feel like a high-stakes wager for your small business. You want to be 100% certain you have access to the best qualified candidates available. I'm sure conferences would use LinkedIn Jobs if, it was applicable in that particular area for, who's the best candidate and this, that, and the other thing. LinkedIn Jobs can help you do that and help you find the right people for your team faster and for free. Go in there, post your job, add the purple hashtag hiring frame to your profile to spread the word that you're hiring. Simple tools like screening questions make it easy to focus on candidates with just the right skills and experience so you can quickly prioritize who you'd like to interview and hire. It's why small businesses rate LinkedIn Jobs number one. That's numero uno in Spanish, delivering quality hires versus leading competitors. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. That's linkedin.com/lockedoncollege to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. Our daily second segment sip out of the way, so we continue on. Let's talk about actual football here, Carter, which is a wild concept in 2023 to talk about football. I know, it's crazy. So I've been thinking quite a bit, because this is kind of what I do. I just think about this stuff all the time. It's how I'm able to bring you content every day all year round, or at least that's what I try to do. The biggest question for every team that will kind of define their season. For Arizona, I said, is their defense going to be better? Because I know they're going to score points. Jaden DeLora, T-Mac, Jacob Cowing, I think they've got solid pieces along the offensive line. They have a preseason all-conference nominee along there, the Wildcats do. So I think that they have enough offensively, but it's, can they do enough defensively? For Utah, is Cam Rising going to play 9 healthy Pac-12 conference games? Because if you told me right now he has to miss 1 or 2, which 1 or 2? Is it when they play Colorado or is it when they play USC? Because those are very different things. For Oregon State, right now, what's the biggest question going into 2023?
The big picture question is, can Oregon State sustain success over multiple seasons? But I think if we're talking about on the field X's and O's, how do they get there? The question for me, interestingly enough, comes on the defensive side of the ball, which was Oregon State's strength last year, but that was kind of a one-off. When Oregon State was building up in the early years of the Jonathan Smith era, it was an offensive first team that had to score 40 points to keep up with its opponents because it couldn't stop anyone. That kind of flipped last year.
Kind of flipped. Kind of flipped. What does entirely flipped look like to you?
Yeah. No, no, you're right. It entirely flipped last year. Oregon State was winning games in the low 20s. One of the best defensive teams in the Pac-12 and kind of a middle of the road offensive team. It was a run first offense behind Damian Martinez, Deshaun Fenwick, Jam Griffin, and you got what you needed out of the quarterback position more often than not. But Ben Gulbranson and Chance Nolan obviously didn't win you any games. With DJ Uiagalelei stepping in, I think your offense returns to the level that you saw in the first few years of the Jonathan Smith era. But then Oregon State loses a bunch of its veterans on the defensive side. So do things kind of start to shift back to, what we saw in the 2018 to 2021 era of this rebuild? If that's the case, it comes back to how good is the defensive front? Can the defensive secondary, prevent too much of a drop off after losing veterans like Rajon Wright, Alex Austin, Jaden Grant? Those are obviously very big shoes to fill. Those are, all Pac-12 caliber players. But I think Oregon State very quietly has built a significant amount of depth on that side of the ball over the last couple of years. This is a program that very often relies on its veterans to come through late in their careers. And, I think you see in 2022, going into 23, a lot of guys stepping into bigger roles as sophomores and juniors. And that's kind of the Oregon State model. If that pans out and Oregon State doesn't really take much of a step backward on the defensive side next year, this team is more than capable of winning 10 games. It could make it to the Pac-12 title game. And that's where your conversations about dark horse college football playoff contender come in. But if the defense does take a step back, if it can't overcome the losses from last year's kind of breakthrough group, that's when I think you start to have concerns about Oregon State's ability to replicate the success it found last year.
I wanted to ask you as well about the Pac-12 media preseason all-conference selections for first and second team. Oregon State showed itself very well in those selections from the Pac-12 media members. I was not a voting member, which was very, very hurtful. They didn't ask me, but maybe one day. Boys can dream. Anyway, so Oregon State, 5 players, 3 on the first team, 2 on offense, 1 on defense, and 2 on the second team. No surprise that Damian Martinez, a first-team running back, along with my guy Bucky Irving at Oregon. It's a talented pair of running backs there. Also, very different styles, those two. Martinez, kind of the physical, downhill runner, one-cut kind of guy. Bucky Irving is like an 18-cut kind of guy. He is jump, dance, jitterbug, zigzag, tornado around through the circle. Just shows you there's more than one way to get the job done there. But no surprise that Martinez, the reigning freshman of the year, is in there. Just one defensive player. Well, I guess 6 if you put Anthony Gold or 7, with and Silas Bolden in there on the special teams as well as returners, which is a testament to the caliber of players that Oregon State's got at certain key skill positions. But offensive line, running back, and return game, you have those all conference caliber players. And the offensive line, Max Chadwick of PFF is really high on it. He thinks it's a top 5 offensive line in the country coming into this year, based on how they ran the ball last year, based on how they performed last year with limited quarterback play. Hard to not see how that is the case with the guys that they are bringing back. But was there anything else that stood out to you about the media's preseason teams and Oregon State's presence on there, or maybe a lack of presence in some areas, like wide receiver, for instance?
Well, I think the big thing is Oregon State had as many offensive first team, preseason. Let me rephrase that. Oregon State tied for the most offensive all Pac-12 first team preseason selections.
Yep.
With Utah. Oregon State, I believe, was second overall when you throw in the defense and special teams guys. Oregon State has as much top-end talent as any team in the Pac-12 this year is what that means. Oregon State has the best returner in the Pac-12 and Anthony Gould, who was an All-American last year. It has arguably the best running back. It probably has the best offensive line. We'll see if Oregon's group is as good as it was last year.
I wouldn't sleep on Utah.
Utah is very good as well.
I think Utah, Oregon. If I had to guess, just like kind of spitballing here, I'd say Utah, Oregon State, probably USC, then Oregon. Oregon's got a lot of turnover for the offensive line this year. A lot.
Yeah. So the point being there, Oregon State's identity for years has been kind of a smash mouth football team that's going to dominate the point of attack, run the football. And what better year to do that when you have arguably the best offensive line in the conference, potentially the best running back in the conference, and a quarterback who is going to help you balance out the passing game and running game a little bit more than you did last year. When you look at the all-conference caliber offensive weapons that Oregon State comes back, I think it's very clear that the Beavers are going to take a step forward there. Special teams, the importance of having Silas Bolden and Anthony Gould on special teams cannot be overstated. Special teams won Oregon State a couple of games last year. The
Oregon game, for instance. Yeah. Quite literally.
Yeah. Oregon State's returners are some of the best in the country, as they proved last year. I think they were very close to the national lead for touchdown returns. Gould had a couple, and I believe Bolden had one as well.
And they're also good. They're also good receivers, by the way.
Right. Yeah, and I think this is what makes the pairing of DJU and this Oregon State offense so exciting is, he's going to be behind an offensive line that's going to give him all the time in the world to operate. And it's not like his receivers are, it's not like there's questions at receiver. There are depth questions, but at the top end, I mean, Oregon State has two of the fastest players at the position in the Pac-12 in Golden and Gould and Bolden, but it also has a bunch of young guys who I think are ready to step up now that some of the veterans are gone. Tyjon Lindsey is gone. Trevon Bradford no longer here. So, they're going to be looking for some guys to step up, and that's a room that Oregon State quietly has been building for some time. So the offensive weapons, as shown on the All Pac-12 preseason list, no shortage of them. Again, just comes back to, can the defense produce a couple of players that can contribute to a level where at the end of the season, we're talking about them as all conference performers.
Here's the question I have about the offense, and I hinted at this a moment ago. I think it's a fair one. Silas Bolden and I just blanked on and Gould, Anthony Gould. Those two guys are small, kind of gadget guys, good receivers, can catch passes, can maybe go over the top, but they aren't that kind of X receiver, big body, the role that Trayshawn Harrison filled a year ago. And he, of course, made that spectacular play to help Oregon State, pull a rabbit out of the hat against Stanford there in the middle of the season and keep their momentum rolling, really, as they, started 0-2 in conference play, kept things going. That was a key moment for it. I look at the receivers in the Pac-12, and there are a lot of good ones. Troy Franklin didn't even make the first or second team, preseason All Pac-12 list. You've got a bunch of, because you just have so much depth. You have Roma Dunze, probably a first-round receiver. Franklin, probably first or second-round receiver. Dorian Singer can play in the NFL. Jacob Cowing is wildly productive. Jalen McMillan is really good. Keep going down the list. J. Michael Sturdivant at UCLA, I think, is a great pickup for the Bruins offensively to help whoever ends up being their quarterback there. Who is that guy for Oregon State? Who's kind of your number one outside receiver target? Because DJU, didn't have everything that he needed to succeed at Clemson. I don't know that they were short on receiver talent, so I think it's a fair question to ask of if he doesn't have that sort of guy to go to the way he probably did have at Clemson, is that going to be a drawback at all, or do you see someone who can kind of step into that role? Because gadget guys are good, but I think you need that one, central wide receiver.
Yeah, I mean, Oregon State hasn't really had a bona fide go-to guy since Isaiah Hodgins left a few years ago. Trevon Bradford kind of filled into that role, and then Trayshawn Harrison kind of picked up, but it wasn't like you had one guy who was significantly receiving more targets than the others. I think this year, Anthony Gould is probably that guy. He's the veteran presence. He's been there for probably 4, almost 5 years now, if I can remember correctly. Guy who knows the system, who's obviously going to help DJ settle into the scheme. Somebody who took a huge step forward last year, and I think now as the guy in that room, maybe they design things to go his way a little bit more. Silas Bolden is probably your big play threat, somebody who's going to line up on the outside of the field. And if you can get him the ball in the open field, he's a scoring threat every time he touches the ball. So, I mean, those two guys, as we've talked about the last few minutes, that's the 1-2 punch at receiver. Those two guys are going to lead the team in receptions. I couldn't tell you right now whether Gould is going to, lead by 20 catches or if Bolden's going to contend and they kind of split the duties of the go-to guy. I couldn't tell you right now. The question for me is, where do they go outside of those two? I mentioned a bunch of young guys. Oregon State has probably 3, maybe 4 true freshmen who are capable of playing right away this year. We didn't get to see all of them in spring camp, but I'm curious to see how the freshmen contribute in the fall and maybe into the season. But outside of that, I mean, you don't have a guy coming back outside of those two at the top who has proven to be a reliable target. So where do you go outside of that? I guess we'll find out. I think that's where the freshmen come in. But I can see why wide receiver might be a bit of a concern from the outside, but I just think the talent you have at the top combined with a quarterback who knows how to get guys the ball, I think Oregon State will be fine.
I don't think it's a concern as much as it is just a question that's out there. You look at the best offenses in the Pac-12, and they have those sorts of guys. Dorian Singer and Mario Williams at USC. Roma Dunze, Jalen McMillan at Washington. Troy Franklin and whoever ends up being the number 2, maybe Trayshawn Holden at Oregon. T-Mac and Jacob Cowing. And that's kind of the guy who I think that's the best example. Is Bolden is very much, and so is Gould, kind of in that Jacob Cowing mold. And I'm thinking about, who's going to be the T-Mac, right? Tetero McMillan down there at Arizona. Like, who's kind of the complementary piece, the other style, that sort of. At Oregon last year, it was Troy Franklin number 1, Chris Hudson was the number 2. Jordan Addison was a number 1. They had a bunch of guys. USC is a little bit different. But that's a good segue into our last topic here. And this is a mailbag question. You can always be a part of the mailbag, whoever you are, however you're listening or watching. YouTube comments are always open, or hit me up on Twitter at Smalls_55 or at LO_Pac-12. This one from Mark. Okay, here's one I have been chewing on. What offensive or defensive schemes are the best in the Pac today and historically? Is the spread offense the undeniable winner in both categories? Thanks for making most every morning a podcast morning. That's how we roll around here, my guy. Your team every day. So, defensively, I don't know that that's quite as interesting of a conversation because it's really just about having personnel and making the right play calls. You can like 3-4, 4-2-5. I think is a really hot defensive formation right now. It is very, very popular because you're in a pass-happy world. So it's basically having an extra defensive back on the field. It's the offense I want to talk about in the context of Oregon State. When you think about the teams that make the college football playoff, Carter, very rarely, if ever, do they look like Oregon State's offense, which is exactly like Utah's offense. I'm not saying they can't win a Pac-12 championship, but if you're thinking down the line, do you think they have to not necessarily change, but just evolve to a more spread explosive style to keep up with the high-flying offenses in the Pac-12 and across the country?
It's a good question. I don't think so because, you mentioned the similarities to Utah. Utah won the Pac-12 2 years in a row, made it to the Rose Bowl, was knocking on the door of the college football playoff, running a very similar system to what Oregon State runs, kind of a smash mouth, short yardage game, really utilizing the tight ends, which if I go back to the previous question about, who aids Oregon State's receivers, it's the tight end position. They have like 3 or 4 guys who can make contributions there. I think as you rely on your offensive line to open up things in the run game, your tight ends to give you 8 to 10 yards over the middle, I think that works for Oregon State. The Beavers were one of the better offensive teams in the league going into last year over, a stretch of multiple years. Obviously, we haven't seen them compete at the highest level with this offense, but coaches around the conference, around the country rave about what Oregon State brings to the table with a running game that it's hard to scheme against, a play action game that it sets up very nicely. So I think there's something to be said for going against the grain. And, when you have teams that are scheming week in and week out for, these high octane spread offenses, and then you match up randomly against a pro style team in Oregon State, it forces you to change some of your tendencies and forces you to change some of your schematics on the defensive side, which I think can kind of play a beneficial role for Oregon State in standing out there.
I think it helps them stand out for sure because there aren't as many teams that do it that way. But I almost wonder if we'll see a little bit of this transition this year in that compared to what you saw from Oregon State a year ago, will you see more shotgun straight drop back passing sets from Brian Lindgren and Jonathan Smith when you have DJ Uiagalelei in there? Like, I think that, I don't think they need to completely change everything. Georgia goes under center a good amount, but Georgia's also in shotgun quite a bit. Georgia's also kind of the exception, right? And you can be a power running team like Michigan, for instance, and get to the playoff, but they don't look like it's a power spread, which is kind of what Ohio State ran with Urban Meyer back in the day. They're kind of that power spread. I think it's too early to tell because Oregon State's still kind of early in their ascension here to answer the question that I asked you in full. But I think it's an interesting one to kind of follow along as the years go by.
Yeah, and I think Oregon State probably isn't going to make wholesale changes to the offense with DJ coming in. This is a guy who chose Oregon State because of the scheme that it ran last year and the year before. When he was doing his homework on programs that he might want to join, he identified Oregon State because it is a pro-style system that he thinks will better utilize his talents than more of the RPO scheme that Clemson was using. So I think, in particular, with him coming in, that's kind of a telltale sign that Oregon State's going to stick with what has worked in years past and just do it at a higher level with better talent.
Carter Bahns, BeaverBlitz.com, senior editor and writer over there. Also the 24/7 Sports National Desk doing plenty of writing. Go check him out at Carter Bahns. That's Bahns on Twitter for those of you listening. Carter, thanks so much.
Thanks, Spencer.
Appreciate everyone listening. I'll see you next time. And until then, have a wonderful rest of your day.